Once again, it's been an amazing Resnick Action Forum, and I'm Walter Isaacson, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you, perhaps for the last time, to the Action Forum. So thank you very much for being here. I thought I'd speak for a few minutes on the lessons that I think all of you are trying to extract from both the Leadership Network and the Action Forum, and perhaps even the Aspen Institute. And as you may notice, since I've been here 14 years, and I hope to be back, but this will be my last year as CEO, I'm also going to reflect a little bit on the lessons I've learned from both the Fellowship and the Institute. The words fellowship and institute are words we use often without really thinking about what they mean. But they have a similar connotation because the notion of a fellowship means it's not just about you. It's about a network of people, a community, a group of people that you're part of, making you part of something larger than yourself. And as I reflect on my time at the Institute, I think of the word institution, and I realize that although we celebrate startups and we celebrate entrepreneurs, there's something very special about being part of an institution. And by institution, I mean it was there well before you came, and it's going to be there way after you leave. And that notion of being part of something that will be there, that has been there, also reminds you you're part of something larger than yourselves. Now, for me, that gets to the notion of what I've discovered most as a biographer. We biographers have a dirty little secret. We make it seem like some great person goes into a garage or a garret or gets on a horse and things change. But what you learn in an institution and what you learn in a fellowship is that it's all about collaboration. Whether it's the great things that have been built or the great projects we're going to celebrate tonight, it isn't just individuals, it's individuals working together in a collaboration. I first realized that when we think of the great founders like Jefferson and Franklin and John Adams, and we think of them as larger-than-life people. And there was a scene when I was researching Benjamin Franklin that really struck me, because they put together a committee, the Continental Congress did, to declare why we were having a revolution. It may be the last time Congress put together a good committee, but it had Franklin and Jefferson and Adams on it. We think of Jefferson as writing this Declaration of Independence. That's not the way it happened. There are 5 different drafts that they all worked on together. And if you see the first rough draft, it's really great because there's Jefferson's greatest sentence, perhaps the greatest sentence ever written by man and certainly by a committee, that begins with, "We hold these truths to be," as Jefferson wrote it, "sacred." And there you see Franklin's printer's pen crossing it out and saying self-evident, because he believed that our rights come from rationality and reason and not the dictates of a particular religion. But it goes on to say, as Jefferson wrote, and they're endowed with certain inalienable rights. And you see John Adams put in, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. So a collaboration just on a half of a sentence helps us balance the role of divine providence and the role of rationality and reason in creating the rights that we have as citizens. If you look at all the great inventions, even of our time, of the digital age, they've all been done by collaboration. If you ask people, who invented the computer or the microchip, the 2 great inventions, or with all due respect to Al Gore, the internet, and you get to the fact that nobody knows who invented them, because they were part of a team, that it was part of a collaborative effort. And that's what you learn here, being part of whatever fellowship it is you're part of. You're part of the Crown Fellowship, you're part of the Liberty Fellowship, but then you also become part of a global leaders network and hopefully part of an institution like ours. If you look at the way the internet was invented, it was done that way. It was to connect the research computers of the various universities that had been funded by the Defense Department, and they decided the best way to save money would be to network them together. They came up with a packet-switched idea, and then they delegated it to the great research universities to figure out how to connect to that packet network. The research professors did what they always do in such situations, is they delegated the task to their graduate students. And so you had 30 graduate students who worked together to try to figure out the protocols for this. But at first they didn't want to call them protocols because they didn't want it to be top-down or hierarchical or one person in charge. So they had all 30 equally in charge. And what they did was they picked the youngest of them to take the notes. And so Steve Crocker, the one who was doing it, decided to make it feel more collaborative. Instead of calling them rules or regulations, he would simply call them request for comment. And that's how the internet was built. It was particularly amazing when I was at Time Magazine, we said it was done that way to survive a nuclear attack. We got a letter from Steve Crocker saying, no, we were graduate students in, the late 60s. Why were we graduate students? We were avoiding the draft, so we weren't there helping the Pentagon. We did it because we wanted it to be collaborative. And Time didn't print the letter. They said they had a better source. I went back and looked at it at one point. And the better source was the guy, Steve Lukasich, who did the funding at the Pentagon. And I asked him, and he said, yeah, we were doing it to survive a nuclear attack, but we didn't tell the graduate students that. They were draft dodgers. So tell Steve Crocker I was on top and he was on the bottom. So he didn't know what was happening. So I told Crocker that, and he said, pause for a second, he said, tell Lukasich that we were on the bottom and he was on top, so he didn't know what was happening. That's the essence of collaboration in a network digital age built on fellowship and institutions that we all help to create. The second great lesson is that even though we're told sometimes to specialize or to look at STEM education or whatever it may be, it's that the great innovations, the great fellowships, the great ability to come up with new ideas really comes from spanning a whole lot of disciplines. It comes from the people who love both the arts and the sciences. When I came here to the Aspen Institute, it had a lot of siloed programs. It all went deep. But looking at things in a silo is never the way to see the cross currents or the patterns that exist. And so that's why we tried to do things where we mix people, including at this great AGLN, the Global Leaders Network, or at our Ideas Festival, or everything we do, so that we're talking about science as well as about the arts, as well as about the humanities. When we talk about media bias, we can also be talking about things like genetic engineering, and eventually you see how people's minds work and something deeper. I remember when writing about Steve Jobs, he always ended his product presentations with the street signs that showed the intersection of the liberal arts with the humanities. The liberal arts with technology. And he said, that's where Apple's DNA is. That's where creativity happens. He says, if you stand both with the liberal arts and with the sciences, you make things that emotionally connect and make people's hearts sing. We hear a lot these days about artificial intelligence, but one of the most amazing things is that in the 70 years since Alan Turing said machines will be able to think, in fact, the progress made by those who combine machines with human creativity has far, far exceeded than machines alone trying to learn or trying to think. And I think it will always be that way because the collaboration I've been talking about also exists among technology, machines, and humans, and whether it's Airbnb and Uber or even the way Google does its algorithms, it's all from the creativity of humans being connected by the technology. It was also true even of Einstein, thought of as just a great scientist. But he loved Mozart, played the violin all the time. And whenever he was stymied doing general relativity, the equations, they didn't work, he pulled out his violin and said that by playing Mozart, he could reconnect to the harmonies of the spheres. To me, that led me to, I think, the greatest of all people who knew the ability of connecting the humanities and arts and sciences. And that was, of course, Leonardo da Vinci. Most people think of him as an artist. If you read the wonderful job application letter he did when he was in his 20s trying to get a job with the Duke of Milan, it's 11 paragraphs long. And the first 10 paragraphs talk about his science, his engineering, his ability to build weapons of war, his ability to make rivers divert, all these things. Only in the last paragraph does he say, I can also paint and sculpt as well as any person. Certainly he did. He goes to Milan and he paints the two most famous and greatest pictures in history, The Last Supper and the Mona Lisa. But during that time, he mainly thought of himself as somebody who loved to see the flight of birds, somebody who loved to understand the flow of waters. And as he understood the flow of waters, and he has the ripples around the ankles of Jesus in the baptism of Christ, he also understood those curls and swirls and how they worked in the heart and how they closed the aortic valve of the heart. He also did things like dissected the human eye to discover that light doesn't hit just one part of the cornea. It hits various parts of the cornea, and it's perceived differently, with the very center being the details, the tiniest of details hitting the center of the cornea, and then the colors and the shadows hitting on the side. And what he does with that is he paints the most famous smile ever painted, which if you look at it and you look directly at it, the tiniest of the details show that the Mona Lisa is not really smiling. But if you look at her forehead or you glance to her shoulder, or you move your eyes just slightly, the shadows and the colors make it smile. And so it's an uncatchable smile. The more you look for it, the less you see it, but it flickers on and off. All because he was able to mix arts and the sciences. Another thing I learned from him, Steve Jobs, and everybody else, and this is something you do, those of you who are laureates to be announced today, those of you who've done your projects, is every now and then you get encouraged by the fellowship, encouraged by the people collaborating with you and egging you on to try just a little bit harder to let your reach exceed your grasp. For Steve Jobs, they called that the reality distortion field. He kept pushing people to do things that they didn't know they were able to do. At one point, the original Macintosh, it took it 90 seconds to boot up. It was almost as slow as a Microsoft machine. And so he tells the engineer, hey, you've got to shave 20 seconds off the boot up time. Larry Kenyon, the engineer, says, look, Steve, look at this code. It's elegant. You can't push it any further. And Steve said, don't be afraid. You can do it. It was something he had learned from his guru in India. He would stare, I remember this, stare without blinking and say, don't be afraid. You can do it. And so Kenyon was so freaked out, he went back to his cubicle. After about a week, he had shaved 47 seconds off the boot up time. He said, I was driven to do things I didn't know I was able to do. We see that all over and over again with Steve in his reality distortion field. I think the last one was when he's deciding he's going to do the iPhone. He doesn't want it to have a junky piece of plastic on the front, so he wants a piece of glass that won't smudge, won't scratch. And all the glass that were, being used he'd seen didn't meet his specifications. Finally, somebody said, call Corning, and indeed he does. And finally has a meeting with the CEO of Corning, explains what he wants, and the CEO of Corning says, well, years ago we invented something called Gorilla Glass, but we never manufactured it. and here's how it would work. And Steve said, yeah, that's what I need. I need this much by September. We're shipping in October. Linda Weeks was the CEO. I actually went to Corning, New York to hear this story because I'd heard about it from John Seely Brown. And Weeks said it was amazing. I kept saying, you know, we can't do this by September. We've never made this before. And he stared at me without blinking. I said, yeah, I know. And he said, don't be afraid, you can do it. After the meeting, Wendell Weeks called a plant manager in Harrodsburg, Kentucky, and from a Corning plant, and he said, I want you to, you know, shift over. I want you to start making that thing we talked about, Gorilla Glass. And the plant manager said, sure, I'll do it in a few months. I'm doing flat screen. He said, no, I want you to do it tomorrow. And the plant manager said, no. And Wendell Weeks said, I just listened to him for a while, and I finally said, don't be afraid. You can do it. The upshot is, every piece of glass on every iPhone that year and every piece of glass ever shipped since then has been made by Corning because they were pushed by people collaborating with them to do what seemed impossible. And finally, the most important lesson of all is about inclusiveness. One of the things we may do wrong here is that we say, you're very special. You got tapped to be part of the Henry Crown Fellowship, or got tapped to be part of the Liberty Fellowship, or the CALI, or the Middle East Leaders Fellowship. And there were so many people competed, but it's an exclusive thing, and you got brought in. What we forgot to say, though, is that it's not about exclusivity in life. It's about inclusivity. Because in the end, you're going to measure yourself, and you're going to be measured by how many people you included in the fellowship around you, how many people you brought along after you had an opportunity. And that is truly the mark of all the great people that I've been able to write about. In some ways, we push a bit. We always tell you to follow your passion. But the motto of the Global Leaders Network and all of its fellowships is moving from success to significance. You're about to hear about the people who've done different things to do that. But in order to move from success to significance, it means that you have to overcome one thing. You have to realize it's not just about your silly little passion. It's about connecting your passion to something larger than yourselves. When I first came here, the first year we did Ideas Festival, we had the Reverend Peter Gomes, the minister, the late minister at the Memorial Church at Harvard. And when he ended his talk, he said something that I've always remembered. He talked about how, when he gave his little graduation baccalaureate sermon, some of the kids would come up to him and said, what do you want to be? What do you want to do? And one of the kids said, I want to be very successful. And Reverend Gomes said, well, that's good. He said, in fact, I want to be very successful. I think I might even want to be president. And Gomes said to him, aim higher. He said, this college has put out a lot of very successful people. It's even put out a lot of presidents. But what it doesn't do quite so well is to put out people who are really, really good. Aim higher is not just about your passion. It's about being good and connecting to the passions of other people. Everybody I wrote about did that their whole lives. You know, Leonardo, it's brilliant. He keeps we have more than 7,000 pages of his notebooks. And I get choked up when I think of the very last page that he wrote. Because of all the things he was doing, he was sometimes trying to push himself to do the impossible. And there was a math problem that was impossible, but he kept trying to do it. It's called squaring the circle. It's using a ruler and a compass only to take a square and to make a circle the exact same size. Now, for reasons that if you understand the irrationality of pi, you understand that's not able to be done. But Leonardo thought it was, and he knew that, but he thought it was important to keep trying Because sometimes when your reach exceeds your grasp, you're not going to make it. But it's useful to know why. So on that last page of his notebook, the very last days of his life, there he is with 4 different triangles, circles in them, shaded areas, still trying to conquer that unsolvable problem. And he keeps writing about it until suddenly the line breaks off and he says, "But the soup is getting cold." Apparently, he was called down for lunch, was the last thing he did. And that reminded me of Einstein, because he too, on his deathbed at Princeton, was still trying to do what we think, maybe he was right, maybe it isn't, but we think is impossible, which is a unified field theory that connects the 2 great theories that Einstein came up with, relativity and quantum theory. And he was trying for the last 35 years of his life to do a unified theory. He never could quite do it. But on his deathbed, there are 9 pages that he had his secretary, Helen Dukas, bring him in Princeton Hospital after he decided not to have an operation for a burst aorta. 9 pages of equations until it finally dribbles off. The pain gets too great, and you see the line go down the page as he tried just one last time to get us one step closer to the spirit manifest in the laws of the universe. And as for Steve Jobs, it was a summer that I was here. Some of you may remember it. I was a bit distracted, and by August, I'd been told by Steve and his doctors that the cancer had hit his bones, and I was going out to Palo Alto. And at one point, we're sitting in the backyard of his house, beautiful, with all the flowers. I said, "What did it all really mean?" He said, "Well, to me, I've begun to feel that it wasn't just about the things that I got, the success I had, but that life is like a river. And if you're very lucky and you're successful, you get to take really cool things out of that river that people before you have put in. Wonderful objects they've made, wonderful devices they've invented, wonderful ideas that they've come up with. And you measure your success by how much you've been able to get out of that river. But now it occurs to me that it's not measured by how much you take out of the river. It's about what you put into the river. And that's what's going to happen to all of us as we understand that our success comes by what we put into the river of history for others to share. And finally, for Ben Franklin, whose whole life was built around inclusivity, he gave to the building fund of each and every church that was built in Philadelphia during his life, because he knew that the secret to what America was all about was people of different races and creeds and colors and backgrounds would all work together if it worked well. And at one point, he wrote the fundraising document for the first sort of new hall, it was called, for visiting preachers who came to Philadelphia. And the first sentence says, "Even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send somebody here to preach Islam to us and to teach us about the Prophet Muhammad, we should offer a pulpit and we should listen, for we might learn." And on his deathbed, he was the largest contributor to the Mikveh Israel Synagogue, the first synagogue built in Philadelphia. It was that type of fellowship, that type of institution, that type of inclusivity that brings us to something larger than ourselves that they were creating back then that we're still fighting for, both in the world today and at home. So thank you all very much. Thank you. Thanks.